Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Asoka Bandarage, who's a Sri Lankan academic specializing in international development, political economy, conflict analysis, and more. She taught at Yale, Mount Holyoke, Georgetown, and other universities in the US and abroad. Her latest book is called Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, in which he analyzes colonial and neoliberal origins of Sri Lanka's woes, arguing that the same mechanisms keep much of the developing world in a state of poverty and constant internal struggle. Dr. Bandarage also wrote an excellent short article for neutralitystudies.com in which she summarizes the issues of her book. The link will be below in the description. Dr. Bandarage, thank you so much for coming online.
Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe let me start with the first part, which is Sri Lanka as a model case for what's wrong with international relations that you like work on in your book. You write in the article that you wrote for me that the Sri Lankan crisis is an illustrative example of convergent global debt, fuel and energy crisis facing much of the world. It is corporate media bias and narrative control that deflects from this analysis. So those are your words. Could you please explain why Sri Lanka is such a model case and what's going on in the global south?
Yes, the Sri Lankan economic crisis, the debt crisis, has been portrayed mostly as an internal phenomenon due to corruption of the local government, mismanagement, inefficiencies, and so on. Of course, those are important factors. And the recent COVID crisis, Ukraine war, etc., also played into creating this crisis, the emergence of it in early part of 2022. But these are sort of surface phenomena. I think the crisis is rooted in the global economic and financial system. And it is not a situation that is particular to Sri Lanka. Even UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 2022, pointed out that about 60% of low-income countries and about 30% of middle-income countries are either in debt crisis or near debt crisis. So this is a global phenomenon. And what does that mean? It means that those countries, the governments are not able to provide for basic needs of people. And there is a lot of suffering due to lack of food, fuel, energy, so on and so forth.
And most of that debt is actually foreign denominated, isn't it?
Yes, only about 10% of it is owed to China. 48% of it is owed to international sovereign bonds, which are Western creditors. And actually, over 80% of the debt is owed to Western institutions, the EU, the United States, and so on. So that has not really been discussed much in the global arena.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing that is quite important to me is always also to point out that there are countries with huge debts. I usually live in Japan, right? And Japan has nearly 300% debt to GDP ratio, but it's not a problem because that debt is owed in its own currency. Whereas if you owe it to other institutions, to the US and Europe, you owe that money in US dollars and in euro, and you cannot print those, you cannot make those. So that's a huge part of the debt trap. And I think it also plays into this issue of neo-colonialism. Now, for me and for many of friends in the West and in Japan, colonialism is something that's like 1,000,000 years ago, right? It's like ancient feudalism. But I think this issue of colonialism looks very different from formerly colonized states, right? Could you maybe talk a little bit about how colonialism makes itself still felt today in countries like Sri Lanka?
Yes, very much so. Although many of these countries, ex-colonial countries, got political independence after the Second World War, the global economic structures continued, and the economic dependence of these countries continued. sometimes taking different forms and shapes, but nevertheless unequal exchange, the devaluation of the labor and resources from the third world countries, terms of trade that were not beneficial to the ex-colonial countries, rising foreign exchange crises. These became endemic, and so the colonially inherited export-import economies continued, and also the dependence on imported food, fuel, and other essential needs, which made the countries very much dependent on the global economy and also the control of Western countries. For example, I give a lot of statistics in my book that the net transfer of resources was really from the global south to the global north. For example, between 1980 and 2017, there was a $4.2 trillion that were transferred from the global south to the global north just as interest payments on debt. So that, is a form of neocolonialism.
One of my favorite sentences that you wrote in that article is, the dynamic is better understood as poorer countries being overexploited rather than underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's exactly what you're talking about. What are the mechanisms that the West uses today to overexploit the global South?
Well, debt is certainly one mechanism, because there is a debt cycle from the time of independence. Essentially, many of these countries were caught in a debt cycle, with internal developments as well, like population pressure, so on and so forth. There were increasing demands, but being tied to the import-export model and with terms of trade going against them, these countries didn't have sufficient foreign exchange to meet their basic needs. So they kept going to the IMF, the World Bank, and so on to get loans. So loans were obtained to pay off interest on previous loans. So they were caught in a debt trap. And in Sri Lanka's case in 2022, it faced the biggest foreign exchange crisis and economic crisis that it has faced in its history.
Yeah, but it seems so ridiculous to me, because what happened to Sri Lanka and what happens to other countries in the global South is something that in Europe, I think only Greece experienced. That you basically give a country that's drowning in debt, you give it more of the same. It's like giving more alcohol to an alcoholic to feel better until the next morning. I mean, but why is it that Sri Lanka, which is not part of the European Union, I mean, Greece was like institutionally then like hammered down. What is the mechanism that in the case of Sri Lanka makes sure that it cannot escape that trap?
Yes, I mean, most countries are caught in this trap. In the 1960s and 70s, in the early decades of independence, many countries tried to move on their independent paths of development, which was more committed to self-sufficiency, import substitution industries, so on and so forth. But there was a lot of pressure, particularly from the Western countries, to stop these countries from going off on their own individual paths of development, like, for example, African socialism, Ujamaa in Tanzania, import substitution efforts in Latin America, nationalization attempts in the Middle East and Africa, so on and so forth. So there was a lot of pressure to keep these countries tied to this dominant economic model. And I give the example from Sri Lanka in 1961. Sri Lanka nationalized foreign-owned petroleum companies, oil companies like Essex, Esso, and Caltex, and so on, without paying compensation. This was a sort of a left nationalist regime that was in power at the time. And the US acted very drastically against this move by passing what is known as the Hickenlooper Amendment in the US Senate, which called for stopping foreign aid to any countries that was nationalizing US companies without compensation. And this had immediate effects on Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka lost its creditworthiness. And although it was undergoing foreign exchange crisis and economic problems at home, was not able to borrow with the loss of creditworthiness. And that contributed to sort of local crisis. And eventually it led to a regime change in 1961 at the elections. And brought into power a government that was much more aligned with US and Western interests.
You know, I had a discussion today with a colleague from Zimbabwe, and he made the point that yes, back in the when apartheid ended, the political power went to black people, but the economic power never did. And the apparatus of apartheid always remained in South Africa, and from there then influenced also neighboring countries like Zimbabwe. And what you were also saying is that part of the trick of keeping the developing world dependent is they can have the political power, but they cannot have the revenue that the state could create if it was actually in charge of its own domestic economy. Is that more or less a correct understanding?
Yes, because as I mentioned, in the 60s and 70s, and even going back to the 50s, many countries tried to stay away from the superpower struggle, the Cold War, and walk on their own paths of development, but there was a lot of pressure and resistance against that. So then you had the period of neoliberalism. Sri Lanka was the first country in Asia to experience neoliberal policies. And with that, there was a deepening of Western control and the involvement of Western institutions. In fact, the president of the time in 1977 said, as he opened the economy, let the robber barons come. So there was intensification of export production, cutbacks in import substitution projects, which had been started by the previous regime, and export of labor to work in the Middle East, garment sector, so on and so forth. So sort of a full-scale privatization efforts, privatizing state-owned companies, so on and so forth. But Sri Lanka is now experiencing yet another, even more intense form of neocolonialism. The neoliberal policies have continued under all regimes, essentially, since 1977. But with the debt crisis and greater intervention, there is a deepening of neocolonial control over resources and local companies and enterprises.
Could you maybe quickly explain for our viewers why is it that neoliberalism is so good for developed countries and so damaging to developing countries?
Yes, essentially it allows foreign interests to come in without any controls. Like neoliberalism involves deregulation, privatization, free trade, so on and so forth, which means that the local countries lose control over their own policies. For example, selling off local industries, more imports being brought in, which leads to loss of autonomy, economic autonomy. So ultimately, when you have a major crisis like Sri Lanka has had in 2022, these countries become so servile and dependent and disempowered that people are standing in lines to get basic fuel and food. And right now, there is fear that there's going to be riots over food, and IMF riots are, well known around the world. And that also leads to political destabilization and greater intervention. So it's not just one aspect, it's both political and economic.
Yeah, I mean, they go together.
Yes.
Whenever somebody says keep politics away from economics, I want to just strangle them, because they're two sides of the same coin. It's just a stupid thing to say. They go hand in hand. We wouldn't have money without government to spend, right? So,
Right.
but other economists, they called this model kicking away the ladder, right? Because of the US and Europe, they became so insanely rich by using import substitution, by using state control of large infrastructure projects, by doing direct intervention, and of course by colonialism. Colonialism is a huge national project in order to make companies gain insane revenues, right? Insane revenues. And then we enter post-Second World War. Suddenly the dogma of the West, if you're not a communist country, is you have to liberalize and you have to allow for free trade. And if ever a developing country even thinks so much as doing something like they did before, they're going to be punished with the IMF stick. Now, it is very ironic that the United States right now warns everybody of the Chinese debt trap. Oh, the Chinese are trying to trap other countries in debt, like Sri Lanka. What do you have to say to accusations like this?
Yeah, because the Sri Lankan crisis is, as you pointed out, it's not just an economic crisis, it's a political crisis. I think we need to recognize that given Sri Lanka's strategic location in the Indian Ocean, in the maritime trade routes, there is a superpower rivalry over Sri Lanka, the Indian Ocean, and the so-called Indo-Pacific. So China was becoming really strong in Sri Lanka, getting access to 99-year lease on the Hambantota port, opening the port city, which sort of was under their own rule. And there was increasing fear on the part of the so-called quadrilateral alliance, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, of increasing Chinese dominance on this very strategic country. And in fact, the former US Undersecretary of State for South Asia had referred to Sri Lanka as a valuable piece of real estate in the Indian Ocean. So there was, in the media, the debt crisis was portrayed as primarily due to China's debt trap diplomacy, referring to the Hambantota port deal, etc. But as I mentioned before, China was owed only 10% of the foreign debt. And when this crisis was worsening in the early part of 2022, there was a possibility for Sri Lanka to get bilateral loans, including 2.5 billion from China, to settle some of the debt payments. But instead, there was pressure on Sri Lanka to declare a default, which was declared on the 12th of April. And there's a lot of controversy around this, saying that it was a staged default, which meant that China was kept away and IMF came in with all its conditionalities. And along with that, Chinese presence in Sri Lanka was diminished. And Sri Lanka has fallen more into the quadrilateral alliance, particularly US and Indian control. So there was a kind of regime, geopolitical transformation there in terms of power balance.
Now, we have to talk about the security and foreign policy aspect. But before doing that, I would really like also to understand how do people inside Sri Lanka understand their own situation? I mean, in the West, basically, a lot of politicians and the general public, they believe most things that come from places of authority, especially from the government. The government could show them an apple and tell them this is a carrot, and then everybody will start calling it a carrot. That's how indoctrinated people in the West are these days. But in Sri Lanka, is this dynamic understood, or are Sri Lankans themselves now very weary about China, and do they blame others and think of the West as the savior, or what's the internal dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, the Sri Lankan mainstream media essentially presents the same line as the Western media, because, you know, there's many interconnections, and the governments and the elite are beholden to Western interests. I mean, they were trying to follow what was called a neutral policy. Not only Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but even prior presidents called for a neutral policy. And even though it's a small, relatively weak country, they were trying to balance these powers, the China, the US and the West and India. But the economic crisis paved the way for, as I mentioned before, for the IMF and the Western interest to become really dominant. Again, in Sri Lanka, it really depends who you talk to. The mainstream media perspective is pretty much the same as in the West. But then among people who are in the know and people who are following the case very closely are very concerned about what's happening. They believe that there was a staged aspect to the default and the crisis, and that it has pushed Sri Lanka more into the IMF Western alliance. And there's great fear about Indian interference, because India and the US are on one side of this power struggle over the Indo-Pacific. And India, while it has helped with loans and economically during the crisis, has also used that to intervene more in local governance, like, for example, calling for a change in the governance structure from a more of a unitarian to a federal structure. You know, that would have great implications for Sri Lanka's political, economic independence and sovereignty. And in fact, in the part of some people, there's a fear that the fate of Sikkim, which was annexed by India in 1975, could be repeated in Sri Lanka, and that Sri Lanka could be annexed by India. Now, whether that is too far-fetched, I cannot say, but certainly Indian involvement in Sri Lanka has increased with the crisis.
It's interesting, that you're saying that, because India at the moment is viewed as one of those neutral countries that doesn't take sides in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the Indian foreign minister has been very, very adamant about saying that they are not picking sides and they do trade with the Russians. But when it comes to Sri Lanka, which is this junior partner in that relationship with India, there is real fear that India itself might actually try to extend its power. So when you look at the economic problems in 2022, do you think actually they were to a good part induced from the outside? And if yes, then how much came from the US and how much came from India?
Yes, I mean, there were certain developments that were not peculiar to Sri Lanka, like, for example, the COVID crisis, the Ukraine war, which impacted economies around the world and led to shortages of essential goods. But in the case of Sri Lanka, in addition to sort of those global phenomena, there was also the geopolitical factors, its strategic location, and the rivalries of these expansionist powers over Sri Lanka, control, like different Hambantota Port is in the hands of the Chinese, Trincomalee Harbor in the hands of the Indians, and then the Colombo Port, again, Chinese, Indians, and Japan. So there's all this rivalry. So there was, and there is evidence to show that there was sort of external factors, political factors, not just economic factors, in the intensification of the crisis and the declaration of bankruptcy or default. And even that itself is questioned whether it was done legally, whether some other interventions could have taken place there, including bilateral loans from China, which could have avoided the default and then going for the 17th time to the IMF for a standby loan.
For a shot. It's,
yes.
Can you help me with the mechanics of this? When a company declares default and bankruptcy, then usually it's being sold off and all the remaining debt has to be written off because the company ceases to exist, right? That's one of these ways how companies can get rid of all debt. Countries, what happens when a country declares default? Why is it that even though you declare default, that the debt doesn't go away?
That's a very good question. In fact, a whole network of economists and other academics and scholars have issued a statement calling for debt cancellation of Sri Lanka, just as Debt Justice and other organizations have called for cancellation of debt in other parts of the world. So even though it's defaulted, the debt has not been cancelled. And in fact, there are lawsuits against Sri Lanka to pay back the debt on time by certain creditors, like US-based creditors. So there's been an attempt to negotiate, what they call haircuts in sort of lowering some of the debt, but there's enormous conditionalities involved, particularly IMF conditionalities, including privatization of state-owned enterprises. For example, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, which was created in 1961 when the left nationalist government nationalized oil companies which were owned by the US, UK, and so on, is now again being privatized under IMF diktat, along with other energy and telecommunications industries.
So again, selling off state property, which is going to be hugely beneficial for a fraction of the price of what it's worth. But one thing I have a problem with as an international relations scholar is to understand what are the mechanisms that these foreign countries use to put pressure on you. I mean, if Sri Lanka tomorrow said, flip the table, I'm not going to pay back my debt, live with it. I'm a sovereign country. If you come here, I'll shoot back, right? That would be something you could do, but that would have huge ramifications. So what is the mechanism that the West uses in order to increase the pain on Sri Lanka if it ever said, we're not going to pay back our debt, forget about it?
Yeah, because there is lack of unity within the country, and the collaboration of local elites and local governments is essential. Just as collaboration was essential to classical colonialism, collaboration is essential to neocolonialism. And in order to stay in power, even some of the more nationalist politicians have had to go along with these conditions, because the politicians are trying to stay in power, and there could be various kinds of threats. In the case of Sri Lanka and the previous president, we don't know for sure, what takes place, behind the scenes, but certainly threats of being taken to international court for war crimes, etc., could have been used in order to get them to go along with certain policies, So there is also much that is not known, but the general dynamics of political and economic control are known around the world.
And it would probably become impossible for Sri Lanka to get more loans in US dollars, right? If it completely defaulted, it would be cut off. And in this sense, what I think is one of the main problems in world economy at the moment is that we only have one system that accommodates all the banking and all the exchange. It's all channeled basically through with US dollars through the US system and through the international institutions that are US controlled. And what we are seeing now is like the emergence of BRICS, right? And the idea of the Russians and the Chinese to create alternative systems, alternative payment systems, which then allow for goods to travel from Russia to Sri Lanka and vice versa without traversing US controlled like infrastructure. Do you put any hope into such an alternative infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of hope around the world, and the promise of moving away from a unipolar system to a multilateral system, particularly with de-dollarization. So I think that's a welcome change because, we need more diversity and shift away from dollar dominance. But with BRICS, I think a small country like Sri Lanka has other concerns, as we talked about before, in terms of political, economic, and even cultural aggression. So I think it is important to look at the BRICS emergence more closely. Are they following really a different model of development, or are they still pursuing profit domination and power, particularly vis-a-vis the smaller countries? So I think these are things to look at. Like, for example, if you look at some of the Indian investments in Sri Lanka, like the Adani company, which has been given the rights to develop wind power projects in a very sensitive economic, sensitive environmental area in Mannar. Those projects were given without prior environmental assessments. So, this is part of the BRICS projects. And so we need to question sort of environmental, social implications. Are there, yes, the de-dollarization is important, but that's not the only thing.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that you're saying that BRICS looks different whether you look at it from India and from China, or whether you look at it from, like, say, Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, or from the Philippines, for that matter, right? I mean, you also have to deal with these bigger powers that are also threatening in several aspects. Now, you also argued that despite this past, when the non-aligned movement didn't really work for Sri Lanka, and also the socialist movement kind of failed, that despite all of that, neutrality is still one of the best ways to go forwards for Sri Lanka. Can you tell us what kind of neutrality you think would help the country the most?
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. In the 60s and 70s, Sri Lanka was a leader in the non-aligned movement, and was really trying to, just like other non-aligned countries, stay away from the Cold War and, move on its own trajectory. And today, I think that is even more important than ever, particularly with the militarization of the Indian Ocean. Sri Lanka was talking about the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace back in the 1970s. I think that many of the presidents and previous in Sri Lanka in recent years of all parties have called for a neutral policy where they could have China, India, US, and other Western countries, and also Japan, all participate in Sri Lanka in economic projects and so on. But that's, I think, still the goal, because Sri Lanka is not an island unto itself. While it's important to have economic self-sufficiency, particularly with regard to things like rice and essential goods and services, it still has to participate in the global economy and not to be aligned with one power. And Sri Lanka has tried to do that, but with, as I mentioned before, with the recent crisis and the Western intervention, it has gone in one direction over the other. But there is a sort of a general feeling in the country that neutrality is the way to go, that Sri Lanka can't be just part of the Belt and Road Initiative or just part of the Quadrilateral Alliance, that it should have room to make its own decisions. And in order to do that, it has to be economically more independent. And Sri Lanka can't do that alone. I think that's where a global movement for whether it's debt cancellation or non-alignment has to be part of a global movement of countries coming together. A country like Sri Lanka cannot resist these dominant forces on its own. And so while BRICS is important on some levels, it's also important for the smaller countries to come together. Like, for example, the debt trap countries. There are, according to Debt Justice, there are 54 countries that are experiencing debt crises, and even more, even according to IMF. So there's got to be sort of global efforts to cancel debts or to extricate these countries from the debt cycle, which keeps them subordinate both economically and politically.
Are you in any sense worried that maybe China might actually take over this debt trap strategy, or do you think China and Russia will use other will not do this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what will happen in the future, but China has its own neocolonial ambitions. Although in Sri Lanka, China is seen as more a benevolent power than the West because of the whole Western colonial experience. But if you look at some of the problems with the Hambantota port and the port city, the environmental and social political implications, there is no assurance that China would not follow, at least in the future, its own neocolonial and domination. So I think that we have to question domination, profit, power at the global scale. I think we have to question the dominant economic model, whether it is China or India or the United States, they're all following the same path of profit-driven growth, while the environment is collapsing, while communities are collapsing. I think that even BRICS, we have to question if BRICS is really moving towards a sustainable model of development and social justice. I think those are the really overwhelming needs of not just of Sri Lanka, but of the world. And we need new institutions and new networks that put environmental sustainability and social justice before profit-making and political domination.
The question is how to achieve that, right? So last question, because small and vulnerable countries have this problem that they're constantly at the receiving end of a very hurtful stick. Now, if you were not in charge of the world, but you were just in charge of Sri Lanka, if you were the prime minister and you have a supermajority in parliament, so basically you can change the laws and you can execute, what would be the policies that you would realize inside Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky question. The previous regime, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa, had a 2/3 majority in parliament. He was brought to power in a sort of a landslide victory. So he had the political power, but he couldn't avoid the economic crisis or the political crisis, which led to his ouster. So what this shows is that it's not just internal issue, but it's part of a global crisis, and there are global actors involved. So we cannot separate the internal from the external. That has been the case throughout, from colonialism to neocolonialism. So that's why, in a way, I wrote this book, Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, because it's not just a Sri Lankan crisis, it's a global crisis. And we need to these are not particular to, of course, there are certain peculiarities, but this is part of a global crisis. So we need sort of more consciousness and understanding globally, because Sri Lanka is seen as that's, internal corruption and mismanagement, it led to the crisis there. But in the Western media and even academia for that matter, there is not a broader understanding of the global and historical dimensions of this crisis.
That's absolutely right. That's why, Asoka Bandarage, I recommend everybody get a copy of your book. Also read the article on neutralitystudies.com to foster that understanding. And I hope we stay in touch in order to discuss again, like, possible ways out of the crisis.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.